Two. There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to RSP podcast. Me, Rajjan Parmar. I'm here with Ioan Grillo, narco journalist based out of Mexico. Thank you for coming on. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good to be here.
Good. Yeah, thank you for coming on. So, the reason I asked you on was just because, even though this is a travel podcast, I have a massive interest in this, and I think it's really important, and I think especially in the UK, not a lot of people really know the craziness and to the extent of what really goes on. So give us your background. How did you get into narco journalism?
Yeah, so I'm from the UK, from the Brighton area. I grew up there in the 1980s, and after leaving school, messed around for a few years, involved in different things, including pirate radio was one thing I was involved in the UK a long time ago, and also protest movements and stuff back then in the early 1990s. And then got into journalism and understood that a way in then to journalism was into doing foreign journalism from a UK perspective, was to go to countries and start working at an English language newspaper. So, people told me, and I found stories of people who had done this. They'd gone to a different country and started working for an English language newspaper for a small amount of money, and that was a way into doing journalism. So I was fascinated by Latin America. I'd lived in Spain for a year and learned Spanish, and was fascinated by Latin American culture, and heard about in Mexico this newspaper, The News, which was an English language newspaper there. So I went over, and I had a background of knowing about the drug issues from the UK. From the Brighton area, particularly when I grew up in the 1980s, there's a lot of drug use. I think more than today, actually.
I don't know. I've been hearing people. Brighton's coming back to life now. Hearing people, get a bag. Shall we get a bag?
There's certainly drug use in Brighton today, and I have nephews in Brighton, and still hear about this stuff. But back then there was quite a lot of heroin use among young people in the area, and there was various teenagers and young men that I knew who died of heroin overdoses from people from school, people from my school and stuff, and other kind of friends of friends and people and other people I knew. So there was kind of an issue of kind of hard drug use then, and a lot of people kind of dropping out. So I kind of had that background among drug users and seeing the drug trade from that perspective. But that wasn't my reason for going to Latin America. I didn't think about that so much. I was more interested when I first went in the kind of romantic idea of kind of Che Guevara, the idea of revolutionaries and people fighting. I'd seen the movie Salvador from the 1980s, which is a film. Yeah. James Woods playing this kind of crazy, broken down photographer covering the Salvadoran Civil War in the 1980s, and it's kind of crazy scenes there. And I was kind of imagined a bit kind of romantic idea of that kind of thing. So I arrived in Mexico in the year 2000, and then quickly began working at this English language newspaper called The News, and very quickly carved myself a beat out covering crime for the newspaper. Partly, I just fell into it. I'd also been growing up, very interested in the mafia and the Godfather stuff. Partly having part Italian heritage, I was kind of fascinated, but kind of identified, in a romantic way as a kid, identified like the Godfather, and I've got Italian last name, so it's kind of somehow means something to me. But I was kind of always fascinated, read all the Godfather books, see the Godfather movies. I remember seeing documentaries like Crime Incorporated back in the 1980s about focusing on the mafia and stuff. So I was kind of also really interested in organised crime from that point of view. And very quickly fell in, part to carve a beat out into this kind of crime stuff. Another very early thing that when I first arrived in Mexico, I was traveling around and seeing a lot of people were taking crack, and I was like, there's a big issue of people taking crack here. So I kind of started looking at where's the crack coming from? Why? How come there's an issue of, who's selling the crack in Mexico City? Where's it coming from? Why are basically a lot of working class guys who are like work on building sites, smoke, going to buy crack and smoking crack and stuff. It's like, this is the stuff you hear about.
And I'm right in thinking that they can, because like the crack they can make there, right? They just need a little bit of cocaine and they can use it and put it into a chemical thing in comparison to what they would need from Colombia to smuggle it into the US. Am I right in thinking crack is a chemical?
So basically, crack is, you have cocaine. Now, cocaine is made using two chemical processes to turn coca leaves into cocaine.
Yeah.
So you first go through one process where you get a bunch of leaves, and you go through this process with a bunch of chemicals and turn that into coca paste. The next stage is coca paste in a called a crystallizing laboratory, which then goes and becomes cocaine. Now, cocaine, the origin of crack is believed to be in the Bahamas, according to one theory in the 70s, and eventually imported to the US, and it goes through another kind of third chemical process. But what you do is you kind of cook it up with baking powder and actually purifies it, but it creates a product which you sell in cheaper crack rocks. So these little rocks of crack, which are cheaper and give a harder boost and are more addictive than a regular cocaine powder. Now, when you get into addiction, it actually gets into a complicated topic about addiction when you talk to people who really study drugs. But there certainly are people who have a problematic use of crack cocaine and crave for it and use it a lot. So I fell into this issue and started doing that around this time. This was 2001 that I was doing this. And we had obviously a big thing happening there, the escape of Chapo Guzman.
Yeah.
From
this was in the launch.
Chapo Guzman, but at the time he wasn't as famous as he became. He was like, one of many names. And it was like making sense of this. And I would phone up a journalist in Tijuana called Jesus Blanconelas. And Jesus Blanconelas was a legend of a journalist in Tijuana who been covering the cartels there for some time. He'd survived being shot. He survived 4 bullets. And he used to, I used to phone him up a lot, and he would give me a lot of stuff for stories and tell me stuff. And he'd make this. He'd been a sports journalist before he became a narco journalist, kind of the original kind of narco journalist, really the kind of granddaddy of narco journalists. And he used to give these sports metaphors to me, and I'd say to him, I'd say, like, Jesus, who's this drug trafficker they arrested? And he'd say, look, do you know baseball? He'd be like, this guy be playing in the minor leagues. And I say, what about this guy, Mayo Zambada? And he'd be like, that guy be in the New York Yankees. So
I really want to talk about this guy, and I'm glad, because I've done my research on him, because I only first heard his name, and I think most people, especially in the UK, don't know his name. I only first heard his name when the trial came out of El Chapo. Who is he? Like, what capacity does he operate? Like, I mean, I know that the only picture I've seen of him is some old one, and now that he's probably changed his look through plastic surgery. Who is he?
So when we get into the Sinaloa cartel, I like to give a very quick fast forward then from that was my original way into kind of narco journalism, and from there.
Well, maybe we can go back to this unless we go in the timeline, because I have so much to talk about. So if we talk about your timeline, and then I kind of want to go back to Felix Gallardo, and because
I'll give a quick fast forward then, and just the intro. So I started off. That's how I got into it. And that was 20 years of going down this path, 2 books, 3 books of it's written for the third one, and covering this that became this insane war, kind of armed conflict that has killed more than 150,000 people and really destroyed this country. And this is what has been the reality I've been covering for the last 20 years. Now, so going to Miles Zambada. So to give people who don't know as well, there's some understanding. You have this place Sinaloa in Mexico, and this area of mountains in Mexico, in northwest Mexico, a place called the Golden Triangle. So these various villages, communities of people, and this is where the cradle of kind of drug trafficking came from. You had these various kingpins emerge from these communities, from these villages, who rose up to become major global traffickers. Now you can look, around this whole kind of family trees. These are often very family related. Different, you have people goes father to son, and brothers and uncles, and it's all very, very connected among these extended families, who then work together as well. I call it sometimes the Sinaloa Narco tribe, like this big extended bunch of families who fight amongst themselves.
Yeah. And
so you have these, the biggest fights have been Beltran Leyva against Chapo Guzman, these different things. But this big kind of kingdom of traffickers, the Sinaloa Narco Empire, which then would dominate a huge section of Mexico, the whole northwest Mexico. They would dominate Tijuana, dominate Juarez, dominate a huge amount of the United States. Now, among these people, you have these different players, and you have the Sinaloa cartel, what we call the Sinaloa cartel, emerging. Now, in terms of names, we only really started using the Sinaloa cartel from about 2006, 2007 onwards, giving it that name.
Yeah.
But this has been a system and a network of drug traffickers going back 100 years. So it kind of gives these various names. You have the Guadalajara cartel, the name given. So these are not like limited companies that somebody forms a company and registers a name. These are kind of often networks, and names are given by law enforcement or popularly, or they start using the name themselves or something. So it's more complicated that. Now, among the Sinaloan cartel, and you have these various, what I call warlords, big chieftains in the cartel. And you have these big figures. Now, El Chapo became the super famous world figure. Now, everyone has heard of El Chapo now. In Mexico, there's a higher name recognition of El Chapo than there is of like Mexican presidents.
Yeah.
How famous the guys. But also in the United States, a regular guy, they're going to have heard of El Chapo. In the UK, a lot of people have heard of El Chapo.
So the Conor McGregor shirt, the classic Conor McGregor shirt after he met with Sean Penn, and then he's wearing the shirt and he's standing in the same stance as El Chapo.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's stuff there. So you have. So I said that El Chapo has become one of the three most famous gangsters on a world level of the last century. I would say the three most famous gangsters of the last century are El Chapo, Pablo Escobar, and Al Capone.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. Yeah.
But this is what we're talking about, really. These are like things, these are like the impressions in the world. It doesn't necessarily translate to really power and money on the ground. So El Chapo became famous. That didn't necessarily mean he had more hitmen under his power. Didn't necessarily mean he had more cash in his businesses. Didn't necessarily mean he was moving more tons of cocaine. So now, from when I was going to Sinaloa, from very early on, a lot of people were telling me the real most powerful figure is El Mayo Zambada.
Really?
This is going back, 12 years. When I went to cover the trial of El Chapo in New York, some of that. And one of the lawyers of El Chapo I was talking to over some tequilas after the case. They had mariachis there. It was a very bizarre situation being with Team Chapo. They had mariachis and stuff. These guys had all made millions of dollars out of this trial.
Yeah.
And he was telling me, honestly, one of these lawyers, that, and this was part of their case, but he was telling me that there was basically a group of them, but El Mayo was probably the senior partner.
Yeah.
The guy. So I believe now, the way I have a analogy or a metaphor of the Sinaloa cartel that I use. It's not like a single top-down corporation. Some cartels are more like that, but the Sinaloa cartel I say it's more like an association, federation of businessmen.
Yeah, that's the term I've heard. Federation is more used to describe it.
In fact, they had a name, the cartel, known as the Federation for a while. So now, let's say if we think about the Federation of Tequila Producers in Mexico, you have a bunch of different tequila producers who all have their own farms, their own big plantations of tequila, and they club together.
Yeah.
They club together for various things, on prices and to defend themselves. And then they elect a kind of spokesman, public face.
Yeah.
And they have a president who's really the kind of power broker. And it might be like, well, Chapo was like the public face.
Yeah.
And El Mayo was really the power, was really the most powerful thing. Now, when all of, I've been to Chapo's village and I've met his mother and his cousins, and and I've stayed in a house.
The story I need to hear about afterwards. I need to understand. Go, continue.
And I've met them, and one thing, like his cousin was telling me was, which I think is true, that the power they have, the way they enforce power in this world it's not all about I'm the boss and I'm going to kill people who disobey. That's kind of a simplistic.
Yeah.
It's about people who can. This is a culture coming from these rural villages and bringing the customs of those rural villages, but then overseeing an international trafficking empire. So in those villages, you've got a bunch of families and a bunch of people, and then you might have two families or two guys who have a fight over something. You might have two guys who are like fighting over a woman or pride or whatever that's happening there. And you get somebody who has the persuasion, go, you guys sit down, you two guys, let's talk this out. Let's, as they say in the United States, let's squash the beef.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot of these, that's what they say, that's what a lot of these powerful figures have, that ability. They're people who are like looked up to.
Yeah.
So you get in these villages, like, so it becomes naturally, these power structures occur quite naturally, where somebody has a problem, they'll go to them. So it's kind of this godfather idea in a way, where they'll go, if someone's got a problem in a village, they'll go to them to say, hey, there's a problem, I've got a problem with this guy, we'll go to you to adjudicate this. So they're power brokers in that area. And that's what a lot of the power, again, not necessarily always in terms of how much money, these people who influence and exert power in these communities.
So it's interesting. And so do you think he's always held the most power then over Chapo? Do you think he has?
So I think you have in the cartel, I think in the Sinaloa cartel, I think so you have a collection of warlords, and I think when we got to the early 2000s, I do believe that El Mayo was probably the most heavyweight figure from then.
Yeah.
But you have various figures. So you have El Chapo, you have El Mayo, you have a very important figure who's not known, and a very important family, of the Beltran Leyva.
Okay, and what are they? Sinaloa?
Yeah, so when you go to the mountains and see the village of El Chapo, called La Tuna, spitting distance away, right next to it, is a village called La Palma.
Okay.
And in La Palma, that's where the Beltran Leyva family are from. So they played, sport together as kids and hung around, and now up in the mountain, the Arturo with El Chapo. And now the Beltran Leyva's a whole bunch of brothers. You've got Arturo, Alfredo, Hector, all of these brothers, the Beltran Leyva brothers. Now, the Beltran Leyvas have, you look around, they had a huge amount of power and definitely rivaled El Chapo in terms of influence and power. You look around Mexico, you look at all of these places, particularly here close to Mexico City, the states of Morelos, Guerrero. These were the turf of Beltran Leyva. And so you had El Mayo, you had Beltran Leyva, you had El Chapo, you had this guy called Ignacio El Nacho Coronel, who was a guy from this same group who was overseeing Jalisco. So when he was killed, this would later lead to the rise of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. You had a Nacho Coronel, and you had a guy called El Azul, the blue one. That was his name, Azul.
I think. Have you been watching the Narcos Mexico? I think he comes into it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he's portrayed as a guy who is a member of the federal agents, who's kind of a corrupt source in the federal agents.
Yeah, that's it. He's part of the government. They go to Rafa and then they don't let him, and that's actually true, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the series. There's truth and there's fantasy. It's a TV series.
Yeah.
One of the weird things about the narco world is it's already so surreal.
Yeah.
Elements of Mexico can be surreal anyway. I mean, there's a famous quote from Salvador Dali when he came to Mexico and then he left and he said, "I won't be going back to a country that's more surreal than my paintings."
I mean, I honestly, like I said, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, I've never been, but I mean, I've been following it for ages, and I think Narcos kind of puts it quite mildly, the stuff that goes on down there.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the extremity of the violence, get into the some of that, the horrificness of what that really means on the ground. Apart from that, it's there's a lot of problems we're having in the UK and the US about this post-truth situation right now. It's very confusing to know what's true and what's not true, because now everyone's got competing narratives, and then people are even defining reality. And you've got Trump. So we're going with Trump's reality, or we're going with the Guardian's reality, or we go with Boris Johnson. It's very confusing. So you know what's true, what's not true. In many ways, Mexico's been living in this reality for a long, this kind of what we're known here as sub-realism.
Yeah.
For a long time, magical realism, is how Garcia Marquez wrote about this. So what I mean is, when you have magical realism, is people, when you look, for example, at people don't know what to believe or believe different things in their emotion, then they can change very quickly. So. El Chapo, if Chapo escapes from prison, like this last time he escaped from prison, the official explanation is he went out of the tunnel. But a lot of people just simply don't believe that. They believe he walked out the front door. I
mean, isn't this with the video? But there is the video of him going.
But then once you get into it's simply belief, it's just like, well. So, but then people can change. So when you get, and also you have mixed this with magical beliefs. And literally, I mean, when you get to a drug trafficker, Nazario Moreno, known as the maddest one, El Más Loco, and he believed he could control minds and had magical powers of mind control.
Yeah.
And I talked to a guy who knew him, and he said he believed this guy had magical powers of mind control. So you get people into a stage where people have magical thinking. It is, and it's not a good way for society to run. It's sad. A lot of people get hurt with this reality. I mean, having rational, logical kind of ways of trying to solve problems is better. And I think that's why sometimes, you kind of try and go into these things. How can this not be changed? How can it not solve it? And it's hard. It's hard. So, it's a very strange. Reality, but also the cross between fiction and reality. So you have these TV series telling the stories of these people. So a lot of people see the TV series, and that becomes their idea of the history, even though these are kind of dramatized. So we look at one figure, for example. There was a book called The Queen of the South, La Reina del Sur. It was a book by a Spanish author who came to Mexico and wrote this book in the early 2000s. Very good novel about this. Now, then they arrested a drug trafficking associate, kind of money launderer called Sandra Beltran. And they arrested her and they called her the Queen of the Gulf, kind of taking the South name. Now, it might have been that the federal agents invented that name to kind of put it on her.
Yeah.
And then you had a TV series of the Queen of the South with the actress Kate de Castillo, who was the one who would later meet Chapo with.
Yeah.
Now, there's, among a lot of people, a big confusion between the fictional figure of the Queen of the South, the real figure of the Queen of the Gulf, and the actress who played the Queen of the South and then went on to meet El Chapo. There's kind of a real confusion between the figures and kind of who they are and what they are. So you get this kind of weird blurring between fiction and reality. Another example of this, quickly, there's going down south into Central America, there was a very good film, brilliant film, worth watching, called Blood In, Blood Out. One of the best gang films in the United States. Best gang films anywhere, great film. Now, it's made as a critical look at gangs with a writer who's a Mexican-American writer, very good looking about these problems. And among the gangs they create, he imagines this gang called Los Batos Locos. They don't even it was originally some kind of street gang, but the Batos Locos. Now, in Honduras, they then created a gang. When the film came out, everyone loved it in Honduras. Street gang was created based on the film.
It's weird, sort of like, I was watching recently this thing. It's similar to what you're saying now. Is that, I mean, have you seen the Sicario films?
I have, yes.
And so I think in the second one is that there is the United States are designating the cartels of terrorist groups so they can put boots on the ground, and that is what's happening now, right? Is that there is that debate.
So yeah, I mean, I made this comparison, in fact, in a couple of stories when I wrote about the attempt to designate Mexican cartels as terrorist groups. And some of the actions they were calling for, it looked like some of these politicians had seen Sicario 2 and were saying that's what we should do. Yeah. So you get kind of this weird interplay between
foreshadowing. Is like someone thinks, oh, that's a good idea. Like, why don't we run with that?
Or like, what are we talking about? Films. So that's and a lot of like yourself, people know and watch the films, which are educational to an extent. They also do glamorize the trafficking life, and it is a lot bloody in real life. But yeah, it's kind of it's a weird play sometimes between, and also the fact that these drug traffickers are so larger than life anyway. That they create, these names. We're talking about El Chapo, El Mas Loco, El Mayo, these kind of names, and they create these kind of totally weird and like surrealist reality anyway, surrealist.
Almost like superhuman, that they're these kind of ghost sort of figures. Like, I mean, this must have been 2018, so I think Chapo must have just been extradited to the US, and I was in Morocco and I spoke to a Mexican guy. I think he was from Sinaloa. Chapo was in the US at this time, and I said, do you think that's the last of Chapo? He said, no fucking way. He said, no fucking way. I mean, I don't know if I believe that. I mean, I look at the prison where he's held now and some of the people he's hanging around with at the moment. I don't know. But, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that they're just got to leave him there now?
Well, the story of El Chapo right now, I mean, so, first we have the situation with his sons.
Yeah. I mean, some of them U.S. citizens, correct? Some of them born in the United States.
His sons, I don't know if any of his sons are U.S. citizens or daughters that are U.S. citizens, but like he has a lot of children, so it's hard to trace because you can identify that, and then he had a lot of he's had a lot of different official wives or official in their sense, and other women that he's slept with and had kids with, so it's hard to trace something of all of these.
Ed Calderon was saying, Ed Calderon runs the Ed's Manifesto page, which is a great page. I love that page. He was saying that El Chapo had girlfriends who got pregnant, and he sent them over the border to have children in the US.
Okay, that's interesting. I have to trace some of these, but the main core of his sons, known as Los Chapitos, the ones in Sinaloa, are the ones who are the real powerful players.
Yeah.
So these These are kids, or so not kids. These are men now who.
Age.
Sorry.
They're coming of age, right? They must be in their.
Well, actually, some of them are now in their late 30s and stuff. So you've got a range of ages.
Yeah.
So these you have Ibana, Chibaldo, these different sons, Ovidio, and these now form a very powerful group within the Sinaloa cartel, particularly around the Culiacan area. And I know, actually, I know a couple of people who went to school with different sons of El Chapo.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know one guy who's from Culiacan, who went to high school with Ovidio.
Mm.
And I know a girl who went to high school with Edgar, who has since been killed by Arturo Beltran Leyva. He was killed back in 2008. So this is a group now which has become very powerful players within the cartel, and what's known as the Culiacanazo, which was the rising up, the insurgent action in Culiacan in October 2019. So when that happened, you had this arrest of Ovidio Guzman by a mix of soldiers and federal police. And then the gunmen took to the streets, and you had, according to some sources, 700 to 800 gunmen.
I mean, I've seen the videos. They were outnumbered, right? I mean, the military were just outnumbered.
So yeah, I mean, according to one source in the military, said that there were 700 to 800 sicarios or hitmen and 350 soldiers. So they're actually double the number of hitmen. Now the police melted away.
Yeah,
they stood aside. Because you had these guys with these 50 cal just belting 50 cals. I mean, this video when they had a 50 cal and they blew a soldier's leg off. You had, loads of guys coming down. I mean, checkpoints with like 100 guys stopping and getting out their cars, burning vehicles, all of these things. Apparently the message, as this happened, again, the cartel is not a top-down corporation. It's like a bunch of warlords and these chieftains. So apparently when the word went out, you had the bigger, the Chapitos started calling a bunch of these other kind of chieftains around the area. Send your guys. So you had these more kind of minor players. I'll send 20 guys. I'll send 30 guys. I'll send 15 guys. So they're all sending their squads of hitmen in and rolling into town in there. And one of the crazy things was, when you normally go to Culiacan, Sinaloa, which is a nice city in many ways, Culiacan, I like it. Food's fantastic. People are pretty nice. That there's a huge amount of drug trafficking money. There's all these drug traffickers, but it's not guys walking around with guns on the street. When you go to the mountains, there you see guys with AK-47s on quad bikes openly. But in the city, it's not that. But when the Culiacanazo happened, you suddenly had it all came out in the open. Just loads of guys taking, the streets were full of, looks like kind of Lebanese civil war type stuff. And they rose up, and the government backed off. Now, it was a very hard decision for the government at that point when you had 700 gunmen on the streets. People had gone to pick up their kids from nurseries, from schools, when this happened, and suddenly found themselves like locking the door, sitting inside the nurseries. People were in Walmarts doing shopping. And suddenly this was happening, and lock the door and just be like, everyone's just sitting there. People end up pulling out the mattresses and sleeping on the sofa, sleeping on them. So this was like, so the government at that point was like, if we don't release Ovidio, then are we going to have a massacre? Now, they made a tough decision. I'm glad I'm not in government to make a decision like that. But it's not a good precedent. I mean, it's basically saying, if you use violence, we can back down. And then, so where does that leave society? Who's in charge?
I mean, was there an argument to send more troops in to defend them, or was just like, we're just not going to get into this fight? Like,
at cabinet level, I don't know at the cabinet level. So you had the Secretary of Public Security, a guy called Durazo.
Yeah.
If it had been under Felipe Calderon, the president, there's a lot of questions about him. But if it had been under him, I'm pretty sure he would have just sent in more troops.
Yeah.
Did the generals say, this is bad? I mean, I know that there was definitely members of the army who were very angry afterwards. Yeah. They felt it was humiliation. I mean, I put the headline of a story I put out there, and the story I put out, the headline was how the Sinaloa cartel beat the Mexican army, and it's a bit like a dig. I know that they get kind of, they find this kind of stuff humiliating, offensive, and in some ways it was a political decision rather than a military loss. But they did. So it was a hard thing. I know certainly members of the military are not happy about what happened there.
Yeah, I suppose it's just I suppose, but in that scenario they were outnumbered. But just for so long, it's so obvious is that, I mean, even I'm guessing Miles Zampada at the moment is that how do they get away with it, with being on the run for so long, when sometimes it's so blatant that they're around? How do they get away from it? And like, for what efforts being made to maybe get El Mayo, or if any?
So first, when they're in the mountains, they're very well protected. So if you look at El Chapo's village, and when you're in Chapo's village, it's this little village up in the mountains, and they showed me the house, and apparently a lot of the time he was on the run. He was living in this house, and he'd come down in the village and go to the church and have dances. There's an evangelical church in the village. They're evangelicals.
Yeah.
He built it for his mum. His mum converted to become evangelical Christian in the late 70s, she told me. And he would come down. I actually sat through a 3-hour evangelical service. It was one of the most bizarre experiences. I sat through a 3-hour evangelical service with El Chapo's family, and El Chapo's cousin at one point introduced us in the service and said, like, we've got, because everyone's like looking around, who are these white people sitting, and it was like, we've got this journalist from, where are you from? England. Okay, he's here to listen to kind of bizarre stuff.
What are they? Sorry, go on, continue. No, go on, continue.
Yeah, they showed me the house that he lived in for a long time. He'd lived in this house, which is up a hill overseeing the village. Now, if you think about, from a standpoint, even if you have the intelligence, even if, say, now obviously you have an enormous amount of bribery. So enormous amount of the military, the police, the federal agents, the judges are bought by the cartels. Now, because you have a bunch of competing cartels and a bunch of competing warlords within those cartels, they're actually competing about how they buy off, who buys off who. So you might actually have a figure who takes money from different cartels and then betrays one. And then betrays one, and that's often you get the attacks because, like, that guy, we paid that guy $1 million, and then he arrested, he bust our lab.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of the dynamics of this. It's obviously not a simple the government against the cartel, but neither is it as simple the government's bought off in a uniform way. You have the government sections, different officials who are bought off by different traffickers. So let's say even if you have elements, so when they try and take down these figures, often you get the Americans getting the information.
Yeah.
So the Americans get the information, for example, that Arturo Beltran Leyva, when they took him down, Arturo Beltran Leyva was in a certain flat living in a block of apartments in Cuernavaca. They get the information and they gave that to the Mexican Marines, who are a kind of elite group. They gave it to the Mexican Marines. The Mexican Marines went in there and took him down. Now, he was in Cuernavaca. So they kind of created a periphery around there, went in there, shot a bunch of people. Civilians died in the shootout. Went in there and killed Arturo Beltran Leyva. Now, if you're in the mountains, even if, say, the Americans or the Mexican intelligence knows that they're there, gets information they're in the mountains, even if they find then an element of, say, the Mexican military to try and go in there. First of all, they have to keep the information really tight because as soon as it gets out, they know. They just tell them. By the way, they got wind of you being in there. You better make a move. So they make a move. But then, if you're in the mountains there, where there's gunmen all over the place, then as soon as the military start going up there in a convoy, all of the spies, they're called halcones, and when you drive in that area, you see the guys blatantly there. They're not hiding. You see guys with radios and guns on the side of the road. Yeah. And they're like, you go past in the car and you can just go to them, like, all right. And they're like, yeah, all right. And they're sitting there with a radio and a gun. They're like calling up. So they're saying, so if you, now I've actually been with a unit of police in Monterrey when we were tapping in and listening to the spies talking about us.
Yeah.
They had like their codes. We were listening on their wave, the wave of the hitmen talking about this stuff. So as soon as any movement of police or military, they start telling them that if you're in the mountains, it's very hard, long way to go. So it's very, as soon as they start moving up, you go. Unless you do like a big airstrike with a bunch of helicopters, but they don't really. They send in the helicopters. I've been in military helicopters. They tend to go in there, but not really with enough firepower. They don't really bring in a whole division of helicopters to do this stuff. So when they have been attempts to get them, it's kind of they get a location, they keep it secret, and they sweep in. Now, when they've got a lot of these guys, it's because the guys they don't want to live in a. The trap of these drug traffickers is they become super rich. They got millions and millions of dollars. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
But they're living in the mountains. So like it's kind of like I got rich, but I can't enjoy my wealth.
Yeah. But so they also like to stay there though, kind of, don't they?
They like. I mean, obviously they like to be around their communities. These are people who are loyal to them. They'll go and they'll build a road and they'll walk, come out, and everyone all the people there. But these people want some luxury. Because if you're living up in the mountains and you're hiding, I mean, eventually, and this is what I interviewed recently Pablo Escobar's son, and he was saying this is part of the thing that like you've got all this money, but you're living in fear, you're living on the run, you're not actually living. So it's kind of like a dream they go to, but you don't really actually enjoy this wealth. So what these guys do is they'll go, okay, I want to go down to the city and live in the city and have be able to have some nice food and have decent electricity and water and kind of basic kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, when they got La Tuta, this one drug trafficker called La Tuta, when they eventually found him, he was living in a cave.
Why? Just because he was
hiding out. I mean, so you're living in a cave is not necessarily you don't think of caveman stuff. Living in a cave, you're thinking of like I want to be in a big mansion. So I see what the reality is.
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, go to a city. And so when they got El Chapo, he got slack by the end. He didn't. He gets older. He doesn't want to. I want to sit in a nice house, and I've got this money. I want to sit in a nice house, and then also you're kind of trapped in the house. So can I go out? Can you go out anywhere? So it's kind of a funny thing of what it means. Now, one thing I do though think of is, you think like if you were like asking you if you were super rich and you were super wanted. So if you got $100 million, and you're wanted. Say you wanted. Where would you go?
Alaska. I thought about this. Yeah, Alaska. Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Cold for little Chapo, I'm guessing.
No, that's the thing. So you're thinking the same way that a lot of us think. Like I was thinking, where would I go? Like hide out. Let's say kind of hide out. I mean, like maybe even somewhere like some far out place in the world. But the narcos, they don't have that global vision. Even though they're running a global empire, they very much think about Mexico. Yeah. And they very much think about the communities they know. There was one guy from the Zetas who they caught a couple of years ago, who was actually in a hotel in Mexico City, not far from where I live.
No way.
And apparently what he did, because a lot of the settlers are really into racehorses, apparently he's sitting in this kind of mid-level hotel, and then go off to the racetrack in Mexico City, go off to the racetrack, make some bets, and go back to his hotel. That's what he was doing.
Yeah.
So, but like these people, they'll think, okay, Culiacan, Mazatlan, Mazatlan's nice, it's a Sinaloan beach town. That's where I'm going to go. Los Mochis, that's their world. They're not thinking, I'm going to go to Alaska.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to like, now one person who did, there was one former governor called Thomas Yarrington. Now he went off to Italy. He was a politician who became Narco. So he was more on that kind of global idea of, I'm going to go and hide out in Italy. But the narcos, you'll find most of the time, I mean, pretty much all the times that you find they're around people they know, they want to be close to their communities, close to what they feel familiar with. But these people, they're not going to necessarily want to be in a foreign country. They don't know a foreign culture. They want to be around their culture, their people.
I can see that exactly, because they probably just have that safety in that community. Whereas I hear stories of the El Chapo's son buys people cars and stuff like that, and there is also kind of a sense of them as just the people around them. They're loyal to them. They look up to them more than if he was in Alaska, he'd have to have 15, 20 guys max. He couldn't have an army like he could in Mexico.
Yeah, but also just not know those places or necessarily enjoy. They want to eat Mexican food.
Yeah,
they eat like in Sinaloa they love seafood. They love sitting around eating seafood and drinking and listening to their music and but that's the atmosphere they like. They don't want to go to some weird. Now Chapo's sons they're a bit different, that generation, and I've met some guys from that generation, and they're quite different because the older generation are guys from these villages who have got pretty low level of education, but some of them are extremely
crazy intelligent. Yeah,
like a pretty low level of formal education. Whereas some of these sons or daughters, some of the new generation, are people who have been to private schools, who have been around, and I met one, and they're a bit like their whole mannerisms are a bit different.
Yeah, I can really imagine.
So it's kind of weird because you're mixing like private school kids with the most insane gangsters. But like, I mean, there's crazy stuff. There was one story in Guadalajara. There was some guy was at school, and a couple of kids, I think, were bullying one of these narco sons. Yeah. So the dad kidnapped and murdered them.
Jeez, he kidnapped the kids who were bullying him.
Yeah, the kids who the guy was, came back, I'm getting bullied at school, blah blah blah. So the dad was like, I realized bullying you. So it's just like, so within the schools is a weird thing, but like a lot of the other side, you'll get a certain snobbish thing actually within some of these private schools, where some of the other rich kids from kind of rich educated families will be like, they actually look down a bit on these narco kids.
Yeah.
Being kind of, you're kind of like, you've got all this money, but you're not smart and you can't talk about stuff. And other kids who will look up to them and follow them and be like, that you're so cool, and it's cool to say, just talking to Chapo's son, he's my best friend. Obviously that's a cool thing of interacting. So
yeah, I can
very weird dynamics of that generation, and this is started in books like this book called Narco Juniors by a journalist here, and look at the whole dynamics of what they call Narco Juniors, the new generation of kind of narco rich kids who have, but they've shown themselves. So when the Chapitos first took power, there are other older narcos saying, well, these guys, you ain't shit. Basically these guys
young, yeah.
And then I think part of the dynamics of the Culicanazo was these guys proving themselves, saying, we could be just as hard, just as tough as you can.
Yeah.
We might have, and these guys are educated, and so we'll see how that works out and what the dynamics are in the years to come.
Yeah, I suppose, and as well, like I suppose this is going on the time because when Chapo was caught, there was more violence along the border, wasn't there? Because people were trying to get a bit more of a share from him, weren't they?
Yeah, so basically you have, I mean, the dynamics of drug cartels are very unstable, but they become more unstable when a big trafficker is arrested or murdered. So that, destabilizes the structure.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a certain warlord who controls a certain territory, packs are there, then he gets killed or arrested, and often you'll have his lieutenants fighting amongst themselves. You'll have enemies moving into the territory and all of this fighting. So when you look around the world and around Latin America, when you have very powerful cartels, so in Brazil, you have in the state of Sao Paulo and the city of Sao Paulo, you have what's known as the PCC, the first commander of the capital. Now they have a monopoly on drug trafficking, drug selling, organized crime in the state of Sao Paulo. Now, because they're so powerful and have such a monopoly, the murders actually have gone down because they're like, we'll keep control. They're imposing their form of government. Now, the opposite is true of Venezuela. If you go to Caracas, every few blocks you've got like another crazy like these little gangs, loads of guns, every few kind of blocks, and they're all fighting each other. So you have just like crazy levels of violence there. So and this is one of the real problems, this is one of the central problems of the Mexican drug war and of trying to deal with this, is that you arrest El Chapo, take down El Chapo, people take his place and there's more violence. You get Arturo Beltran Leva, there's more violence. So now there's a whole bunch of fragmented cartels and cartelitos around Mexico fighting. And where's the end in sight? Now, unfortunately, there's no obvious solutions to it. But in terms of
going to go on to, like, what do you think? I mean, any you're crown king of Mexico on top of Chichen Itza. What do you do to try curb this?
So there's three things I look at, and I find that a bit uncomfortable, that metaphor.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, especially with the history of the French Empire imposing foreign European kings in Mexico and then ending up dead. But but in terms of what I believe is the way forward on this. Now, I believe there's three areas that we should look at in terms of policy, and these are broad things. So the first one is in terms of drugs. How do we deal with the drug situation? This is like an international situation. This affects drugs in the UK, in the US. This affects Mexico, Brazil, a whole bunch of countries.
What is their influence here in the UK? Would you say is it big? Because I always hear that, like, in the UK, it's always, people always say it's the Albanian gangs, but I would think that that the cartels in Mexico have a reach here because they go to the Costa del Sol, from what I hear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, one thing is, are they involved in traffic of cocaine that could end up in the UK? Very possibly. Probably yes. I mean, it doesn't have to come through Mexico, but there's Mexican traffickers involved in stuff. If you look, for example, the guy who was recently killed, El Chino Anthrax, was arrested at Amsterdam airport. Amsterdam is basically a big kind of stock exchange for drug trafficking. So if you look at when you go back to the Liverpool gangster known as Cocky, was the guy who went, he was bringing a lot of cocaine into the UK, and he was hooking up with Colombians, but he hooked up with them in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was a big. So you have connections with Latin American cartels, and cocaine's coming in, definitely. But the other thing is, they're not involved in actually at a kind of street level or even a mid-level. They're more involved in getting cocaine, making deals with drugs. When it gets to the street level, of drugs in the UK. You've got a whole variety of people now. Albanians are big. I heard that.
Yeah.
Understand asking around in Brighton, it's Albanians selling a lot of the cocaine in Brighton now.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, it's the Albanian gangs in Cambridge as well. I heard it was the Albanian gangs moving in as well when I used to live there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have the you know, at a kind of street level or even at the mid level. So like when you have, so you know, when you look at drug trafficking going down, often it can go through 7 different hands from when it becomes like a ton of cocaine. Somebody sells a ton, somebody else sells it in 100 kilo, 50 kilos, somebody else sells it in, you know, kilos, and it gradually goes down the chain. I think even in the mid level in the UK, it's hard to know exactly who's really involved in the mid level trafficking in the UK, but I don't think it's Mexicans there in the UK. I think more like involved in the deals of bringing it over at big level to Europe, and you have it going through Spain and different places.
Yeah.
But anyway, in terms of drugs solutions, so what do we do about drugs? So like, so we think in the world you have about $300 billion, according to the United Nations, spent every year on illegal drugs.
Wow, would you say? I would say that might be a little bit even conservative as well.
It might well be, and we don't know because these are not good numbers on this. I mean, the US now is 150 billion. So we've got this huge market of illegal drugs. Now, we've had this policy of prohibition, which hasn't worked. People still take drugs, and then we've created violent criminal organizations all over the world. So how do you try and move forward? So you have this concept of damage limitation. I mean, when we go back to the drug war as it was conceived in the 1970s, it was an absolutist idea of we can, and this is what Richard Nixon said, we can have a world with no illegal drugs. You know, he believed that. There is no heroin. You know, your kids can't take heroin because there is no heroin. He believed that he could achieve that. Yeah. Even in the 1990s, there was a United Nations conference, and it had the slogan, "A drug-free world. We can do it." These kind of like ideas. Now, these are nice ideas.
Yeah.
But these are fantasies, which I also believe that kind of absolutist fantasies, unfortunately, are affecting things like other ideas of campaigns around the world today of people saying we can have none of it. Yeah. Now, this kind of really, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And when you have these absolute ideas, now certain things you can really get rid of in the world, but other things you have to contend and be realistic about. So you get the concept of damage limitation. And that's a better, more pragmatic way for me of dealing with many problems in the world. Yeah. Not everyone, but many problems. Damage limitation. How do you reduce to the lowest level you can, realistically, without the excess damage of what you achieve? So if you're saying, well, by prohibiting drugs, what I'm doing is creating an excess problem of making massive values around illegal drugs, and $300 billion or $400 billion or $500 billion going to insane warlords who are destroying countries. So, okay, damage limitation. So first of all, we could say, okay, well, what drugs can we legalize? So there's not a question of like, here's a button and we legalize everything. It's like, okay, what drugs can we legalize and regulate? Okay, marijuana. In my opinion, we can. I think the UK could move forward on this. I think you could probably find a majority of opinion in the UK supporting legalizing marijuana.
I think you would. I mean, I think you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't. I mean, there's just so much that can be done with it in the UK, and it's not as much as a problem as the other things.
Yeah. So this gets back to politics is broken right now. Unfortunately, politics is broken. But like, try and have politics doing something useful. How about it? Legalize marijuana. Now the problem is you have this parliamentary system, and in the US now you've got states legalizing it. In the UK you can't have a county suddenly legalizing marijuana. It has to go to parliament. But it's kind of a shame that issue hasn't been effective politically. But if you legalize marijuana, that takes out a huge amount of the drug trade away out of organized crime. Now you still also have health campaigns. The same with health campaigns about alcohol. Now, alcohol, your generation drinks less alcohol than my generation did. That's a good thing. I mean, like, to be honest, you know what I mean? I'll be honest about it. We used to have a lot of, you still have a lot of teenage drinking in the UK. But actually, the numbers show that there's less people going to the pubs less, and they're actually drinking less than people used to.
But I think there might be more underage drinking, right?
Yeah, I've seen some numbers. I cited a number recently from a survey, and it was actually a global survey on drinking. But it looked at global survey on drinking from 2000 till now, and drinking had gone down something like 5% globally. So some big survey they did. Okay. I right now I'm actually not drinking, and for a while I drunk quite heavily. So habits change. So you can change actual habits and discourage stuff without making it illegal. Actually, look at the health stuff. So first of all, anyway, so like marijuana, again, have health stuff, because there are issues, particularly with very strong kind of what we used to call skunk, but very strong concentrated strains of marijuana on teenagers can exacerbate problems like schizophrenia.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I've seen that as well. So it definitely, it does have its side effects, as like anything.
Yeah. But, I in fact, I have a sister who's schizophrenic, and her developing schizophrenia may be linked to or exacerbated by use of cannabis back then. It's going back to the 80s again. But anyway, so so you have this issue there, but but legalize it, regulate it, have health issues about it. Hopefully, you could still have that. So that takes one chunk of the drug market away, but then we still have the hard drugs. Okay, heroin, cocaine. Ecstasy is a reasonable deal in the UK, but okay, ecstasy, cocaine, heroin. Crystal meth's a big deal in the US, not so much in the UK. So what do you do with these hard drugs?
Apparently, crystal meth's bad in Brighton. This is what I've heard. Apparently, meth's getting quite bad in Brighton. There's like an underground culture of it getting growing now. This is what I hear.
So how do we deal then with the harder drugs? Like, how can we deal with them? Now, the first thing, I don't think we can have a discussion about legalization, but I think there's not an opinion in favor of that at all right now. So, and can you actually really see a situation where a shop sells heroin? Now, if a shop sold heroin, as soon as somebody died of it, you're going to sue the shop, or how's that going to work? So, and also you have in the US a problem where you have a lot of drug addiction in the United States actually being legalized drugs that have been done through abusive practices of the medicine. The whole oxycodone stuff.
Yeah.
The US. So, in the US, they had a crazy culture for many years of doctors prescribing and giving out too many drugs. So, okay, so how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing you have to look at is really have to look at the public health issue of drug rehab and a culture of helping people who have drug problems. Now, one survey I saw in the US, or reported by the US Medical Association, was that 90% of people who need help because of their abusive drug treatments are not getting it. 90%. Wow. So for a start, it's putting money into that. Putting money into saying, okay, now you're not going to help everybody. Now, I've got friends in Brighton who were former heroin addicts who now have got out. One of them, funny enough, was a heroin addict for a long time, kind of missed out on a bunch of things, never got a career, and then recently, this is how crazy, won the lottery.
No way, really? No way.
And now those guys better off than us.
Wow, that's a great. I suppose I gotta be happy for him, haven't I?
Absolutely. Great luck to him. So some people will get out of drug addiction. They'll find a way out through rehab help.
Yeah.
So you give people rehab help, and so that's a big part of the thing of trying to reduce. So by getting everyone you get out, you're taking money out of the cycle of drug addiction. There are some alternatives, and this is a difficult issue, and people who work with addiction or have been addicts know more about this, but like there's different drugs. You had for a long time methadone, which was problematic, I think, methadone, but it did help. You give people methadone, then you have methadone addiction. There's other drugs they have now which are I think less problematic than methadone for like giving people so they can actually still go to work, even if they have a drug problem. They can still go to work, they're not totally destroyed. So you have these things. So that's on the drugs issue. Now, issue number 2 is on prevention, crime prevention. So you have, I've been to the neighborhoods, the areas, a lot of profiles on the young men and boys who become drug cartel hitmen, traffickers, how they get into this. Now, a lot of the time, it's people with broken families. Now, this is what people, I did an interview a couple of years ago with a guy from the Barrio Azteca, who's a very brutal gang cartel in Ciudad Juarez.
There's a dog in the background. There's that dog in the background.
There's always a Mexico City. Which are basically like war criminals, to be honest. But anyway, he was talking about the people he recruits. They look out for who's going to be a good recruit into the cartel.
Yeah.
And it's like they know that if a kid's like got a nice family, they're generally not going to be a good recruit. They're looking for people who are like angry, hateful. This is a lot of the art as well goes to the gangs in the UK or anywhere.
Yeah.
This is a fact, and this is something we should look at. The idea of family units or having love, basically.
Yeah.
People who have love growing up and stability. It's not even, money is also a part of it, but also it's about love and stability and everything. Are not going to be recruited as easily. But a lot of what's happened and part of this process of the cartels in Mexico has been these massive shifts. So you have people who move from the countryside to Ciudad Juarez to work in factories. Often the factory would only employ women, so the dad was left without a job. He'd leave, go to the US. You'd have a single parent family with a mum in a factory, the kid by themselves in the neighborhood. These kind of different processes that happen. A lot of them have got pretty hard, processes. One profile of a guy I look at in a new book is a guy I knew from Honduras, who's a nice guy in many ways, but a guy who had a lot of hate inside him as well. And he was abandoned as a kid. His mum went to the US and just left him and abandoned. And he grew up on the street and like care. In care now, you look at so many kids in detention in the US come out of care homes.
Yeah.
And I knew a guy from my hometown. This is exactly the story. He came out of care homes, ended up in youth prison, detention center. And it's like very clear path to having stability and love. And it's not, it can be the nuclear family, but it's not just the nuclear family. It's just having love. I mean, so that's a big part of it. But and really what that means in Mexico a lot of the time is social work, is projects, is there's very good social workers out there. Give them the money, give them the resources, help bring to kids, engage with kids. And we're not talking about kids when they're a lot of the time 17, 18. By that time they've often become serial murderers. We're talking about kids when they're 10, 11 years old, 9, 10, 11 years old. That's the age often they're vulnerable now.
But how do they get them? Like, how do they get them and initiate them in? Like, I mean, what do you have to do to become initiated into the gospel?
So very, very simple. So a lot of the time it's as simple as you start off, say in Ciudad Juarez. You'll be in a neighborhood in a slum area, in a poor area, very little resources. So you got the mum's off in the factory, the dad's not there. So in a day, where'd you go? You got no parental guidance, no family there keeping you on. So you hang out on the corner. It's a bunch of kids on the corner who are a gang. Now it's not often in those gangs. They're not often like formalized gangs. I mean, a lot of the gangs are in Central America, but it's like a bunch of kids hanging out in the corner. You're playing football with them.
Yeah.
And these are guys who have got guns and who are like involved in protecting the neighborhood. Now, these gangs have then been recruited by the cartels. So the cartels then go to these guys and say to them, say to a kid who's like 12, 13 years old, okay, you want to make some money, you want to be something. I'm going to give you $50 every week, and I'm going to give you a mobile phone. And how else are you going to get a mobile phone? Give you a smartphone. And all you got to do is stand on the corner, and any time a car comes past, you put a text message and tell me what the car is. You phone up and you say, this is happening. You're my eyes in the neighborhood.
Yeah. And then
you're in. And then after, it's like, okay, well done. You've been doing well, and you've been paid and stuff. And I'm going to give you a job of moving, and you can carry on. You can move. You got to carry this package from this place to deliver this over there, or simple stuff as go and buy, go to the shop and buy a bunch of, buy some crisps and some biscuits and all this stuff and bring it to this certain house where we've got a bunch of guys hanging out. And then it's very quickly to, sadly, and then you're going to go and do a hit on this person. We're going to start training you up. Here's a gun, and you're going to carry out murder. Now, there's a friend of mine who's a rapper in Ciudad Juarez called Axa Kamikaze, very, very good rapper. If anyone wants to check out his stuff, Axa Kamikaze, Belzebub Crew. He was describing this and describing that he's seen these older guys brainwashing kids, going to them and describing and telling these kids, "Hey, you're going to be okay. You're not going to end up in prison. We've got all our guys controlling this stuff. You're not going to, you'll be okay." And then some of them, they use them as cannon fodder, and I don't care if these guys. So that's the kind of the recruitment. But when this thing is all around you, and this is so pervasive, and sometimes their dad was in the cartel or their uncle, or so you've got this stuff very, very pervasive, and the normality and the violence is very normalized, and they're used to seeing dead bodies on the street. They're used to seeing gun battles happening around. Then it's not really a big stretch to jump and become part of this. So it's got to be about how, as a society, we reach out to these people. And the question of society is challenging these days. What does society mean? Government, business, social media. What is society? Education. By getting in and reaching out to these people and providing an alternative is the second big thing. Now, the third is the question of police, the question of law enforcement, the question of the justice system.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. There's a big debate about police now in the United States, and they're bringing it out into the UK.
Yeah.
Now, police in the modern world. This is a big question. What kind of police do we want? In the UK, and I, in the UK, was a young left-wing activist in the UK who was like, yeah, the police are terrible, hate the police. And then I come to a reality in Latin America where you really have violence.
Yeah.
And that violence is really oppressive. It's not, and it's not, sure, you have some bad situations in the UK of people living on bad council estates and they've got a difficult reality. But for most people in the UK, okay, you've got problems of crime, but you don't have the issue of crime where you're going to worry about your kid being kidnapped. You don't have the question where you start a shop and you open a shop and then you're going to have to pay extortion money.
Yeah.
And so you realize that having a justice system, having a police force is necessary in a modern world. Now, you can obviously make it better and talk about what the best police force is to have. Now, in Mexico, police is dysfunctional. In most of Latin America, the police is not really working. It's hard to find good examples. And there is a balance between repression and how much, the police, by its nature, the police is repressive by its nature. It has to go in and arrest people, and it has to have a monopoly on violence. However, to have an idealistic idea of saying, well, because the police is repressive, that's all we care about, but armed criminals are very repressive in a community. So how do you try and build and create a police force which really try and make things better? And that's one of the huge goals, to try and make a better situation in Mexico and Latin America.
I mean, that must be so hard in Mexico, because there must be such a history of mistrust. I mean, I was reading your book yesterday, Gangster, Warlords, and that story of the town, what's it? I hope I pronounce that, Iguala, of the mass graves of the students, when there was clearly the police involvement. And that's such a heartbreaking, sad story. I mean, can you repeat it for those who don't know the story?
Yeah, so Iguala was a case in 2014. I mean, and this is when you have how bad the police can be. You had a bunch of students who were student teachers who were in this town, part of a protest group, and the police, who we believe were working with a drug cartel called Carreras Unidos. The case is so messed up, it's hard to even know any of the basic facts, but the police arrested loads of these kids, had a gunfight, started firing on the kids and shot dead a couple of them, and then they abducted 43 student teachers, and then they disappeared. And the official explanation is they were taken to a rubbish dump, piled in a bonfire and burned. But then that's massively doubted as well. So we just don't know what happened, but they've never turned up. They've disappeared. So complete tragedy. So this is what the police, how bad the police can be. You know, when you have a level of the police which are active wings of a drug cartel, then also working with political interests. That's terrible. But how do you construct some kind of police force some kind of justice system and police force, now, in some ways, the things are so bad now, it's actually, like people talk about impunity. So impunity, like how many murders do you solve? And right now, 90% of murders are unsolved. It might even be more. Basically, it means that in 10% of murders, somebody's arrested, but often they're arrested on people, so we don't even really know. Which means that you can murder someone and get away with it. So that's the problem here. Like if you want to kill somebody, if someone that person's really pissing me off, I'm going to kill them. Yeah, you can likely do it and get away with it. In the UK, if somebody thinks that person's pissing me off, they don't think I'm going to kill them, because they think, apart from the idea of kind of moral codes, the idea of even if someone's out there, they're going to probably be put in prison. Yeah. If you allow people to murder, they carry on and murder goes up and up. So how do you try and create a police force which is better? I mean, someone's just trying to stop. I mean, someone's right now, I feel it's just having allowing basic things like control of roads, and really kind of stopping things, really going, back. But that's the 3 points anyway. So I think about policing, about the drug policy reform, and about prevention and changing the communities.
I mean, it's so hard. It's such a big ask. I mean, I suppose as well is that they don't just get their money from drugs anymore, do they? There's stories of extortion of oil, weapons trafficking. It's a crazy influence. And the wall isn't doing much either, is it?
No, I mean the border wall. I mean, well, right now we've got the border wall there was already fencing and stuff on the US border. What Trump did was expand it. There's still ways of getting drugs in. There's still ways of people going in. Right now it's tougher as well because of the pandemic. So you've also got harder to actually go into the United States. But even so, people are still finding ways of moving drugs in. And so, we'll see. Plus, like you said, it's a portfolio of crimes: sex trafficking, human smuggling, piracy, extortion, kidnapping, and all of these things.
I mean, it's crazy the amount of sort of. I mean, did you hear about those? I mean, I'm sure. Of course, you must have. The cartel members who were caught in Malaysia. Was it Malaysia? The Sinaloa cartel members that were caught in Malaysia. Yeah. I don't know what they were doing, diversifying or whatever, and then they were helped to get back. They were in jail in Malaysia or something.
Yeah. So you basically have a long history, particularly of buying precursors in Asia for crystal meth.
Okay.
So crystal meth, you make it by normally buying certain medicines which have been made in regular labs.
Yeah.
Regular, chemical, part of the chemical industry, or the pharmaceutical industry. So you have certain medicines you buy, and then you take them through a process to create crystal meth. So like, where do you go and buy them? People find out all around the world, countries which make these different drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, medicines, buying them, and yeah, that's the way it is. So.
Wow. So yeah, it's so yeah, it's so crazy how they've managed to like to spread their wings. And I mean, one thing, this is also something just that really, like, this is just really personal out of interest, is all this customized gold-plated guns and stuff that they have. Like, I mean, with the inscriptions up, I mean, where do they get their stuff from? I know, I mean, obviously they have the money, but like, I mean, I can't imagine Chapo sitting at his laptop and ordering it off the dark web. Do they have like gun makers or?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you get, like, with the if you look at some of the gold-plated AK-47s and gold and diamonds, they buy the regular guns. Then they have craftsmen in Mexico, or it might be in the United States or in Mexico a lot of the time, who'll just take a regular gun and they'll stick on gold plates, they'll stick on precious stones. There's a lot of craftsmen doing this. So if you want to be a craftsman, I mean, because they've got money, a lot of people are going to want to earn some money, and are going to build their their gravestones, their tombs, their mausoleums, their houses, all of these things, their items, people could dedicate to that and work for them. So that's the way that works.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that must be the same in their gravestones and I mean, I've seen the pictures of these graveyards, and they look like almost cities almost.
Yeah. Absolutely incredible stuff. Yeah, the mausoleums you have there. Yeah, sure, yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, why is that? Why do they have such lavish gravestones? Or I suppose it's part of that culture in Mexico of the reverence of the dead, or
yeah. So I think there's definitely, you can look at this, and some anthropologists could have some interesting stuff to say about this. There's a certain culture, this is particularly within the Sinaloa cartel, where there's a culture of very ostentatious. I mean, part of the cartel identity and the narco trafficker identity is like, I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to be somebody. I'm going to be brave and live these adventures and be idolized. And because life can be very short, and you could die at any minute, and you're not thinking like me or you might be thinking about, I've got to think about a retirement plan. I've got to think about like what I'm going to do in the future. You're not really thinking about, you're thinking about, okay, how can I leave my legacy? And so having a really extravagant, tomb is like, that's an achievement in life. I was there. And it, I mean, you could get into this idea of, which you do see in Mexican culture, in things like the Day of the Dead, of death not being final, but death kind of going to the next stage, and your spirit is still living on, and that kind of idea as well.
Interesting. It's really interesting because one thing which I know a lot of people in the UK don't know, and the only reason I first kind of found out about it is because I saw it in Breaking Bad, but I still don't really understand what it is the cult of Santa Marta. This cult that they worship, this death cult. I mean, can you explain what it is, where it comes from?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I answer this question and maybe one more, and then I better round up after that.
No problem. Yeah.
So La Santa Muerte is a kind of weird religious deviation, which is popular across Mexico and among the Mexican diaspora, and is kind of venerating a skeletal female figure. Now, some people who are Santa Muerte practitioners or practices will also be Catholics, although the Catholic Church will rally against it. Some will be kind of treat it as its own religion. Some will be kind of, have their own deviations. But basically, they venerate this figure. It can be kind of regular people who just kind of like to venerate this figure, and into kind of, some people could be into kind of New Age stuff, and they like kind of like incorporate into their New Age stuff this kind of weird skeletal figure. But some are like drug traffickers, hardcore drug traffickers. A lot of them, because they're into this whole different world and kind of they create their own cultures, they're like outside of regular society. So you see, beforehand they adopted a lot of the Cuban santeros, the whole weird kind of thing there, almost like a kind of voodoo type thing that comes out of Cuba. And then they kind of moved on to this stuff, and they have ceremonies they've created. And this idea, because they're living in a very different moral code where they're committing murder and committing a lot of bad stuff, they can find it hard to incorporate that in the regular church, although some of them do. So some of them have this kind of weird stuff, and so they'll be praying, venerating to this, and some of them will literally feel they'll talk to her as she, and it kind of takes away some of the traditional Catholic idea of communication directly with saints, which you see a lot in Latin American Catholicism. But they'll have this kind of weird thing of saying, she will protect me from, bullets. So I'll pray to her, and so I'll go to a gunfight, and I didn't get hit, so she protected me from bullets, and I'm going to thank her afterwards. And that's the kind of weird code you get in the holy death, they call it.
Oh, interesting. And that comes from like Aztec times, and where like the violent is that right? Or
well, the people have claimed that it kind of gained organically quite recently, in quite recent years. It kind of took off this venerating of this figure, and then some claim it was restoring an Aztec, or what they call Mexica, deity, and it was kind of a restoration of that came to a new form there. But like a lot of anthropologists have looked at this, they say that like certain levels of Latin American Catholicism will have incorporated traditional aspects. So you have, for example, in Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe belief, which is this brown-skinned kind of Virgin Mary type figure. So which they say was also taken from like pre-Hispanic, gods and figures they had in religious things there. Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. So I'll give you one more question, and then I'll leave you to go. But what do you think's next? What do you think will happen? Do you think that they'll get designated as terrorist groups? Do you think boots will go on the ground? What do you think is the next thing against in this?
Well, I'm reassessing a lot of things now, because this year this has been so connected to the United States, and the United States is so nuts right now.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of hard to figure out that whole, everything's kind of up for grabs right now, because the US, we've got Trump, we've got the Black Lives Matter protests, we've got, defund the police, we've got conflicts within the media in the US, all of these kind of crazy things happening. Now, it depends a bit if the US, how far the conflict becomes in the United States. There's clearly big political divisions in the United States, and big political conflicts. Where's that going to lead? How far? We don't know. So now, if the United States in some ways becomes weakened by this, how does that affect Mexico? Because in fact, is that even actually maybe better for Mexico or worse? Now, in some ways, it's worse because Mexico relies on the US economy, but also when the US economy gets weaker and Mexico looks more internally, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And Mexico kind of, in some ways, is looking. Mexico's been living through crisis for many years, but in some ways, right now with this whole pandemic, I feel Mexico starts to look less unstable because the United States is starting to look really unstable. Well, actually, Mexico's not quite so bad. So are we, with the drug violence, we've been seeing this rise of violence. Now, has it kind of plateaued, or will it get even worse? No, I don't know. I hope, obviously, I hope it's better. Living here. With the drug war, I don't see the solutions I mentioned. I don't see coming, particularly soon. So you get to kind of, where you're administering this violence, you're kind of living basically around this violence, but you still kind of live around the drug cartels are there, the gangsters there, they're making a certain amount of money. Does it reach a level and we kind of just tick over with this life as normal? But a very last point, I think one of the reasons why it's important to understand the kind of crazy violence in Mexico right now is that around the world, is it going to be useful to understand this, to understand things that might start to happen in the United States or in Europe? We'll see. But is there going to be actually more of a meltdown of societies in Europe and the United States? And so you're going to see a rise in kind of organized crime in that dynamic.
It's impossible to tell, isn't it? Who really knows? Because I mean, the type of money which is made in Mexico is enough to almost run a country. If that money can be made in Europe, if the power can be taken.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I hope this is not the case. But we'll see what happens in a few years. But it does seem like politics is broken.
Yeah.
Now, when politics gets broken, and politics cannot find solutions. Now, in the UK, you have politics is kind of been, or whatever, in the US, you have politics broken. Now, law enforcement, obviously heavily criticized and obviously way too violent, and also the issue of racism.
Yeah.
But law enforcement did generally keep organized crime in check. Now, if law enforcement breaks down and no longer keeps organized crime in check in the United States, what's that going to mean?
Yeah, it's scary, isn't it? Because like you say, I mean, even just from like a Mexico point of view, is that it just can weaken the system. You don't know what can go on really. Yeah. It's scary. I mean, I heard a rumor that even if troops went into Mexico, that the cartels would poison the drugs to create a health crisis in the UK, in the US.
That's
one crazy theory I have.
I don't think they would do that. That would probably be bad for their own business because, in fact, one of the interesting, talking about that, last little anecdote, all the way back in the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s. So the US, actually, it was a bit later in the 1970s. The US started working with the Mexican government to spray marijuana crops with chemicals.
Yeah.
And they used one called paraquat, which is like this name of this chemical, to spray the marijuana crops. But because they were spraying it, poisoned marijuana was turning up in the US.
Oh, I see.
So they were smoking stuff that people were getting hurt because of the chemicals being sprayed. Now, when that happened, there was US politicians going, God, stop that, because that could be my kids smoking the weed.
Yeah.
And hospitalized because of spraying. So I mean, it's not really good for business poisoning your own drugs, because people would then be careful about buying drugs because, but the thing about the idea of US intervention, it's not a solution, because, you have in Mexico, hundreds of thousands of people probably working and affiliated to cartels. Even if you find, let's say, if you find the location of a cartel camp in Chihuahua, Mexico, you go in there, you destroy that place, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
And then all it does, it creates a huge international incident, huge, thing. And what actually difference did it do? So in terms of the idea that this could be like how they dealt with, say, Al Qaeda, and kind of hitting cells of Al Qaeda, doing these kind of raids, because Al Qaeda had relatively small numbers, so you could fight this kind of war. You can't do that with drug cartels. Strategically, let alone in terms of the moral issue, it just isn't going to work. So So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, thank you for coming on, Johan. It's such a. I mean, I'm sure we could go on for hours, but I will leave you to it. But tell us about your books, where we can find them, what they're about, and what are you working on? Anything new?
Yeah, sure. So my first two books are called El Narco, published in 2011, about Mexican drug trafficking. Gangster, Warlords, published in 2016, looking across Mexico, Jamaica, Brazil, and Central America, comparing these different drug warlords, gangster warlords. And my latest book, due to come out early next year, provisionally called Blood, Gun, Money, about gun trafficking, firearms trafficking in the United States, in Mexico, in Latin America, in the world, the gun trafficking from the domestic US market to gangsters and criminals and cartels around the world. And that's the stuff. And I'm also still publishing in the New York Times, publishing in various places. And you can check me out on Twitter, Ioan Grillo, website, Ioan Grillo. Also have a bit of stuff up on YouTube, also all under my name, Ioan Grillo.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. It was a pleasure to have you on. Thank
you.
Okay,
Raj. Take care. Anytime. All the best then.
Yeah, thank you. And stop recording.